this big scribbly diagram is showing mutual inductions or electromagnetic induction. And what is happening is we have a coil on what is called the primary winding of a core. So over here on the left-hand side is the primary winding. It's attached to a core, which is this ferromagnetic material. And that primary winding is on the left-hand side, and over on the right-hand side, there's a secondary winding. We are going to pay for something in here on the primary winding, and what we are going to do is our useful output over here on the secondary winding. For example, this could be a transformer. We are going to do something like input on the left, output on the right. Input on the primary, output on the secondary. We want to do something over there on secondary. We're going to do it by spending money to put some current in on this primary winding. So our primary winding we see here has a current running through it. We are going to vary that current with a resistor. So this is just a variable resistor. I can put more resistance in, which will give me less current flowing. I can put less resistance in. If there's less resistance, I will have more current flowing through these coils on the primary winding. Now, we know from electromagnetic induction, what we know so far is that if this current on the primary winding is one current, is unchanging, if current equals 20 amps, for example, and it doesn't change, then nothing happens. So let's say you have a DC current, nothing happens. When that current changes, when there is change in the current of a coil that is wrapped around a ferromagnetic material, we know that there is a flux induced inside that material. And that's what Faraday said to us. Faraday said, as you change the current, increase the current or decrease the current through these coils, you are going to be inducing a magnetic flux. Those magnetic lines of flux are magnetism. Flux lines are individual lines of flux that represent a magnetic field. So you are going to make a magnetic field if you change that current. So here we go now. We're still on the primary side. We've spent some money. We turn on a voltage source here. We vary this resistor. We keep varying this resistor, and the current is, let's say, increasing. And since it is a changing current and it is increasing, then this flux, these magnetic lines of flux inside this core are going to start increasing. There are going to be more and more lines of flux. The flux density is going to increase, and we are going to establish magnetism inside the core. As that current is increasing, we get more magnetic field inside this current. It gets more magnetized. It is a growing field of magnetic flux. Current goes higher and higher and higher. Magnetic field goes higher and higher and higher. More magnetism inside the core. Now, we put a winding over here on the right-hand side. We call this the secondary winding. And the secondary winding, same thing. Faraday's law of electromagnetic induction says that if there is a change in magnetic flux, not if there is a magnetic flux. Faraday doesn't care if there is yes a magnetic flux or no a magnetic flux. Faraday cares if there is a change in magnetic flux. So since this magnetic flux is growing and growing and growing because the current is growing and growing and growing because I'm decreasing resistance. So since this flux is growing and growing and growing, then it is going to be inducing a EMF inside the secondary coil. And the current is going to be increasing because the magnetic flux is growing. So now if I'm looking at only the right-hand side here, oh my goodness, I have a coil. It is wrapped around a core. I did nothing else to it, but just because this coil is wrapped around a core, it's got current in it. There's a voltage induced, and I can do something useful. That's my output. Pretty cool. I didn't put any voltage in this circuit. I used magnetism to get the voltage in that circuit on the right-hand side. Cool. So the magnetic flux has induced some voltage over there. I got voltage just from a magnetic field. So cool. And then that magnetic flux is going to close this circuit. So this is a full magnetic circuit. I paid for some current on one side. I got some current on the other side at a different voltage. Now, why would you want to do this? You're wondering, well, you want to do this because sometimes you want a different current and voltage than what you pay for. I want to pay for a little bit. I want to use the magnetism and I want to get a lot out. Okay, so this is to step up and step down my current and my voltage. There are applications for that. The biggest one being a transformer. Okay, so that's what all of my my chicken scratch drawings here talk about. Let's follow these drawings. It says, I want to pay for some current here. I'm inducing an EMF. I'm, using a power source here. I'm going to change this resistance. I'm going to decrease this resistance, therefore increase the current. This current is changing. When there is a changing current around a ferromagnetic material, it induces magnetism inside the core of that material. Inducing magnetism means that there is a magnetic flux. That magnetic flux is a growing magnetic flux. If that magnetic flux is growing, it means it's changing. So over here on the secondary winding, Faraday again tells us that if there is a changing magnetic flux, then it is going to induce an EMF in any coils that are wrapped around it. So now I have an EMF in the secondary winding. Thank you very much to Faraday, who got that from this magnetic field, who got that from the changing current. All right, let's see, that's a secondary winding. That gives me useful output. Now, as the resistance decreases, the current in the primary winding will increase. If the current increases, then the flux will be induced and it'll increase the flux as well. Let me see, still decreasing resistance with respect to time. Decrease with respect to time means that you're increasing the primary current with respect to time, therefore increasing the current or the magnetism with respect to time. What's going to happen in secondary winding? It has the flux moving through a solenoid, which is going to induce current in the secondary coil. That's great. Note, flux from the primary winding links to the secondary winding, so that is called the linkage. Now, I am going to put this resistance down to a constant level. And what's going to happen if I have a constant, I'm going to put a constant resistance, I'm going to get a constant current, and constant current is going to make magnetic flux collapse. It doesn't just go away. It's not like we have flux or no flux. We had a growing magnetic flux, and now I move this to a constant current. It's going to collapse. Actually, it takes a little bit of time for it to collapse, but it will collapse. If I were to draw this again with a constant current on the left-hand side and a collapsed magnetic flux, which means that there is no magnetic flux, then on this side, on the secondary winding, it's sitting there, just sitting in a unmagnetized ferromagnetic material. So there will be no current induced in the secondary winding if the resistance is constant, if the current is constant in the primary winding. There will be no induced voltage in the secondary winding. Now let's talk about if we increase this resistance. if I increase the resistance in the primary winding, then I will be decreasing the current. If I decrease the current, it is a changing current. Faraday didn't care about current. Faraday cared about changes in current. If I decrease the current in the primary winding, I will decrease the magnetic field. The magnetic field will be constantly decreasing. The flux will be getting less dense in that ferromagnetic material. A decreasing magnetic flux is still a changing magnetic flux. So in my secondary winding, I will still have a changing magnetic flux. Therefore, it'll induce a EMF in the secondary winding. Changing magnetic flux induces an EMF in the secondary winding. I still have this happy face, still useful output. As long as this current is changing on the primary side, then the flux lines are changing. They are growing or they are collapsing. They are growing or they are collapsing. That means it's a changing magnetic flux through the secondary winding. Changing magnetic flux induces a current, induces voltage in this secondary winding, then I can use it. So I need a change in primary, makes a change in flux, links to a change in secondary. And that's how I would describe mutual induction.